Losses. It was just after 5:30 when Fokir nudged his boat out of the creek's mouth. Although the wind had stiffened, Pia took heart from the fact that the sky was clear for the most part, and in the beginning the wind and the waves were more a help than a hindrance. They were pushing the boat in the direction they wanted to go, so it was like having extra pair of hands to help with the rowing. Pia had her back to the bow, so at the outset, when the wind was behind them, she was able to watch the waves as they advanced on the boat from the rear. At this point, there were just undulations on the water surface and there was no foam on their crests. They swept up quietly from behind the boat, raising the stern and then dropping it again before moving on. After half an hour, Pia took a reading of their position and was reassured by the results. If they managed to keep up the pace, she calculated they would be back at Gargentola in a couple of hours, probably before the storm broke. But as the minutes crept by, the wind kept strengthening and the dark stain in the sky seemed to spread faster and faster. Their route, in any case, was a circuitous one, involving many changes of direction. Every time they turned, the wind came at them from a different angle, sometimes hitting them in such a way as to make the boat list. As the speed of the wind mounted, the waves grew taller and flecks of white appeared along their crests. Although there was no rain, the wind carried the churning spray right into their faces. Pia's clothes were soon wet and she had to lick her lips to keep them from developing a crust of salt. On entering their first Mahona, they ran into waves much taller than those they had already faced. When the water curled up ahead of them, they had to strain against the oars to carry the boat over the crests. They seemed to be working twice as hard to cover half the distance. It was as if a once level track had now been stretched over a range of hills and valleys. Pia took her next GPS reading after they had crossed the Mahona. Brief as it was, the operation gave her a minute to catch her breath. But there was nothing heartening about the reading itself. It confirmed her impression about the drop in their pace. It had slowed to a crawl. Pia was reaching for her oars when something brushed against her cheek and fell into her lap. She glanced at it and saw that it was a mangrove leaf. She looked to her left, the direction from which the leaf had come. It so happened that they were in the center of a wide-bodied river. She estimated that the wind had carried the leaf a good 2 kilometers from the shore to the boat. They made another turn and now Pia found herself rowing with her back to the wind. It was oddly disorientating to be hit by a wave coming from her blind side. After it had lifted her up, there would be a dizzying moment when the boat seemed to hang on the crest of the watery ridge. Then suddenly she would find herself tobogganing backwards into the wave's trough, clutching at the gunwales to keep her balance. Water came sluicing over the bow with each wave, and it felt as if a bucket were being emptied on her back. The impact of these descents soon began to shake loose the assorted bits of plywood that covered the boat's deck. They began to quiver and rattle, and the wind caught hold of one of them and tore it off the boat. It vanished in an instant. Minutes later, another slat of plywood went spinning away, and then another, exposing the boat's bilges. Pia found she could see right into the hold where Fakir stored his crabs. Another turn brought the wind around so that it was hitting them side on, tilting the boat steeply to one side. The oar in Pia's right hand was now almost a third of a meter higher than the other. She had to lean sideways over the gunwale to bring it into contact with the water. As the boat tilted, her backpack began to roll around under the hood. She had thought it would be dry there, but now it hardly seemed to matter. The spray was coming at them from so many different angles that everything was soaked. The boat lurched again and the pack was tossed into the air. It would have gone over but for the hood. Pia dropped her oars and scrambled forward to throw herself on the backpack. All her equipment was in it, her binoculars, her dip sounder, everything except her GPS monitor, which she had attached to a belt loop on her pants. The backpack also contained all the data she had gathered over the last 9 days. She had put all the sheets in a plastic bag and fastened it to her clipboard. Pia was looking for some means of securing this precious piece of luggage when Fokir interrupted his rowing to pass her a length of rope. She took it from him gratefully, and after threading it through the pack straps, she bound it tightly to one of the bamboo hoops of the hood. Then she opened the flap just wide enough to check her equipment. The backpack was made of a heavy, waterproof material, and its contents were more or less dry. As she was closing the pack, her eyes fell on the pocket where she kept her cell phone. She had not activated it for use in India, so it hadn't been charged or turned on since her arrival. Now, as the boat was heaving and listing below her, a sudden seizure of curiosity made her press the power button. Her spirits leapt at the sight of a familiar green glow of the screen, only to fall again when an icon appeared to indicate that there was no coverage where she was. She put it back in the bag and fastened the flap again before returning to her oars. The wind seemed even stronger now, and the boat's tilt was even more pronounced than before. As she pushed the oars, her mind strayed back to the phone. She remembered reading accounts of people making calls from under the wreckage of derailed trains, from the rubble of houses that had been demolished by earthquakes, from the burning towers of the World Trade Center. Who would she have called? Not her friends on the West Coast. They didn't know where she was, and it would take too long to explain. Kanai, maybe? She remembered that along with his address, he had also written down a couple of phone numbers on the back of his present. One of them was for a cell phone. He was probably on a plane now, on his way to New Delhi, or maybe he was in his office already. It would be strange to reach him. He was sure to say something that would make her laugh. She bit her lip at the thought of this. It would be good to laugh right now, with the boat groaning as if it was going to come apart at any minute. She shut her eyes tight, as she used to when she was little. Let it be on land, she said to herself, muttering aloud, as if in a prayer. Whatever happens, let it be on land, not the water. Please, not the water. The boat banked into another turn, and after they had rounded the corner, Fokir rose to a crouch and pointed in the direction of a distant spit of land. Garjantola. The Mega? She said. Horen? He shook his head, and she raised herself to get a better look. It took just a glance to confirm what Fokir had indicated. The boat was not there. The waters that flanked the island were empty except for the white-flecked waves. She was still trying to observe this when the wind caught hold of the gray plastic sheet that lined the boat's hood, the remains of the U.S. mailbag Pia had recognized when she first stepped into the boat. Suddenly, a part of the sheet broke out from under the thatch. It billowed outwards like a sail, and there was a fearsome cracking sound in the timbers. It was as if the wind were a clawed animal doing all it could to tear the boat apart. The boat's stern reared up as the sheet strained at its ties, pushing down the bow. Fokir dropped his oars and threw himself forward to cut the mailbag free. But even as he was hacking the plastic bindings, there was a loud cracking sound, and the entire hood tore away from the boat and went sailing off into the sky, with Pia's backpack trailing behind like the streamer of a kite. Within minutes, the whole unlikely assembly of objects, the hood, the plastic sheet, the backpack with all its equipment, its data, and Kanai's gift, was carried so far off as to become a small speck in the inky sky. It was almost 11 when the Mega steamed into the Ramengal's Mahona and turned in the direction of Lucy Bari. The water, Kanai noticed, had become peculiarly translucent. Against the steely darkness of the sky, the brown water seemed to glow like neon, as though lit up from beneath. This was the widest expanse of water they had crossed, and the waves were taller than any they had encountered yet. The sound of the Botbotty's engine changed in rhythm with the waves rising to a plaintive whine as it plowed into the swells. So much water flew over the bow that the windows of the wheelhouse were continually awash in spray. Through most of the journey, Kenai had sat in the wheelhouse with Horin, who had grown increasingly taciturn as the wind picked up speed. Now, as the Mega met the waves of the Mahona, Horin turned to Kenai and said, "We're taking on a lot of water. If it gets into the engine, we're finished. You'd better go below and see what you can do." Kenai nodded and rose to his feet, stooping to keep his head from bumping into the low roof. Pulling up the hem of his lungi, he tucked it in at the waist before opening the door. "Be careful," Horin said. "The deck will be slippery." No sooner had Kenai turned the handle than the wind tore the door from his grip and slammed it back on its hinges. Kenai kicked off his sandals and left them in the wheelhouse. Then he went to deal with the door. He had to step around and put his shoulder behind it to push it shut against the wind. Step by step, keeping his back against the bulwark, he began to move towards the ladder that led to the deck below. The ladder was exposed to the wind, and he felt the gusts clawing at him as he put his foot on the first rung. Had he been wearing sandals, they would have been torn from his feet. The wind was pulling at him so hard that he knew it would take only a slight slackening in his grip for the wind to tear him from the ladder and send him into the churning water below. When he stepped off the last rung and entered the caverner's galley, his foot sank immediately into ankle-deep water. He spotted Nogan, deep in the deck's unlit interior, standing beside the casing that housed the diesel engine, grimly boiling water with a plastic bucket. Kenai waded through the water. "Is there another bucket?" Nogan answered by pointing to a tin container afloat in a slick of oily water. Kenai took hold of its handle, but when he reached for the water, he was all but knocked off his feet by a sudden lurch of the Botbotty's hull. Righting himself, he found that to fill the bucket was far more difficult than it might seem, for the Mega's pitching kept the water moving in such a way that it seemed almost to be toying with them, making them lunge ineffectually from side to side. In a while, Nogan broke off to point to the shore. "We are close to Lucy Barry now," he said. "Is that where you're going?" "Yes, aren't you?" "Not us," said Nogan. "We have to go to the next island. It's the only sheltered place in this area. You'd better go and ask my grandfather how we're going to drop you off. It won't be easy in this wind." "All right." Kenai clawed his way back up the ladder and went step by step along the slippery gangway to the wheelhouse. "How is it down there?" Horin said. "It was bad when we were in the middle of the Mahona," said Kenai, "but it's better now." Horin flicked a thumb at the windshield. "Look, there's Lucy Barry. Do you want to get off there, or do you want to come with us?" Kenai had thought this over already. "I'll get off at Lucy Barry," he said. "Mashima is alone. I should be with her." "I'll take the Botbotty as close to the bank as I can," Horan said. "But after that, you'll have to wade across." "What about my suitcase?" "You'd better leave it behind. I'll bring it to you later." Kenai cared about only one thing in the suitcase. "I'll leave everything but the notebook," he said. "I'll wrap it in plastic so it won't get wet. I want to take it with me." "Here, take this." Horan reached under the wheel and handed him a plastic bag. "But be quick now. We are almost there." Kenai let himself out of the wheelhouse and stepped into the gangway. A couple of steps brought him to the cabin, and he opened the door just wide enough to slip inside. In the half light, he unlocked his suitcase, took out Nirmal's notebook, and wrapped it carefully in plastic. The engine went dead just as he was stepping out again. Horan was waiting for him in the gangway. "You don't have far to go," he said, pointing to Lucy Barry's embankment, some 30 meters away. Along the base of the earthworks, where the waves of the Mahona crashed against the island, there was a fringe of foaming white surf. "The water isn't deep," Horan said, "but be careful." As an afterthought, he added, "And if you see Moina, tell her that I'll go back to get Fokir as soon as the storm lets up." "I want to go too," Kanai said. "Be sure to stop at Lucy Barry." "I'll pick you up when the time's right." Horan held up a hand to wave him off. "But be sure to let Moina know." "I will." Kanai went aft to the stern where Nogan had already pushed out the gangplank. "Step onto it backwards," Nogan said. "Use your hands to hold on, as if it were a ladder, or else the wind will knock you off." "All right." Kanai tucked the plastic-wrapped notebook into the waist of his lungi in preparation for the descent. Then he turned around and stooped to take hold of the edges of the gangplank with his hands. Immediately, he knew he would have been blown into the water had he not taken heed of the boy's advice. Without using his hands, he would not have been able to withstand the pressure of the wind. He crawled backwards on all fours and straightened up as he stepped off the plank. He held on to the plank for a moment, steadying himself as his feet sank slowly through the water and into the mud. The water was about hip deep and he could feel the current surging around him. He moved the notebook up so that it was pressed against his chest. Then, keeping his eyes fixed on the shore, he began to wade towards the embankment, stepping carefully with his bare feet, making sure of his footing. When the water fell to the level of his knees, he breathed more easily. He was almost there now and knew he would make it. He heard the Botbati's engine starting up somewhere behind him and turned to look. And then it was as if the wind had been waiting for this one unguarded moment. It spun him around and knocked him sideways into the water. He thrust his hands into the mud and came up spluttering. He scrambled to his feet just in time to see the notebook bobbing in the current, some 10 meters away. It stayed on the surface for a couple more minutes before sinking out of sight.